In 1955, in the humid heat of Southeast Asia, a divided nation became the center of a global struggle. Vietnam was not supposed to be America's war. Yet, over the next 20 years, more than 2.7 million American service members would deploy there. They struck, then disappeared. American policymakers faced a difficult reality. Conventional military strength did not easily translate into control over a rural insurgency. By 1963, over 16,000 American military personnel were in Vietnam, still classified as advisors. That same year, political turmoil in South Vietnam intensified. Buddhist protests erupted against Diem's regime. Televised images of unrest reached American living rooms. In November 1963, Diem was overthrown and assassinated in a military coup. 3 weeks later, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The responsibility for Vietnam shifted to Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson inherited a complex situation. He faced rising instability in South Vietnam, increasing Viet Cong attacks, and a Cold War climate that framed withdrawal as weakness. In August 1964, an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin changed everything. U.S. naval vessels reported attacks by North Vietnamese patrol boats. The exact details would later become heavily debated. But at the time, the Johnson administration presented the incident as unprovoked aggression. Congress responded with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It granted the president broad authority to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. The war escalated rapidly. In 1965, American combat troops officially landed in Da Nang. What had once been advisory support became active ground warfare. Operation Rolling Thunder began, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam intended to weaken its capacity and morale. But bombing did not break North Vietnamese resolve. Instead, the war expanded. American strategy relied heavily on attrition. The goal was not to capture territory permanently, but to inflict greater losses on enemy forces than they could sustain. Search and destroy missions sent U.S. troops deep into jungles and rural regions to engage Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army units. The terrain was unforgiving. Dense jungles limited visibility. Rice paddies flooded with monsoon rains. Underground tunnel networks allowed enemy forces to move undetected. The enemy did not always present clear targets. Guerrilla warfare blurred the line between battlefield and civilian space. American soldiers, many barely out of high school, found themselves fighting in unfamiliar climate and culture. Helicopters became symbols of the war, airlifting troops into remote areas, evacuating wounded, and providing mobility in terrain where roads were scarce. Technological superiority was evident, but it did not guarantee clarity. Back home, the war was being televised. For the first time in American history, images from the battlefield appeared regularly on nightly news broadcasts. Footage of firefights, bombed villages, and wounded soldiers entered suburban living rooms. Public opinion began to shift. At first, many Americans supported containment of communism. But as troop numbers climbed, eventually exceeding 500,000, and casualties mounted, questions grew louder. What was the objective? Was victory measurable? Could the war be won? In 1968, the conflict reached a turning point. During the Vietnamese Lunar New Year holiday, known as Tet, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched a massive coordinated offensive across South Vietnam. They attacked cities, military bases, and even briefly entered the U.S. embassy compound in Saigon. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was costly for communist forces, but strategically, it shook American confidence. For months, U.S. officials had suggested that victory was near. Tet suggested otherwise. Television images showed fighting in urban streets, contradicting official optimism. Influential journalists began questioning the war's direction. Public trust eroded. 1968 became one of the most turbulent years in American history. Anti-war protests intensified on college campuses and in major cities. Demonstrators argued that the human cost outweighed unclear strategic gains. In April, Martin Luther King Jr., who had spoken out against the war, was assassinated. In June, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, a presidential candidate critical of the war, was assassinated. The nation was fracturing under the weight of both foreign conflict and domestic unrest. President Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. Richard Nixon campaigned on a promise of peace with honor. When Nixon took office in 1969, he inherited a war deeply entrenched and deeply controversial. His strategy centered on Vietnamization. The idea was to gradually withdraw American troops while strengthening South Vietnamese forces to take over combat responsibilities. Simultaneously, Nixon expanded bombing campaigns into neighboring Cambodia and Laos, targeting supply routes known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The expansion of the war sparked new protests. In 1970, National Guard troops fired on student demonstrators at Kent State University, killing 4. The war had come home in a different way. Despite troop withdrawals, fighting continued. American prisoners of war remained held in North Vietnam. Negotiations in Paris moved slowly, complicated by political demands on both sides. Meanwhile, events on the ground continued to shape public perception. The My Lai massacre, which occurred in 1968 but became widely known later, revealed the killing of unarmed Vietnamese civilians by American soldiers. The revelation intensified moral debates about the war's conduct. For soldiers serving in Vietnam, the experience was complex. Some believed strongly in the mission to contain communism. Others felt increasingly uncertain. Many simply focused on surviving daily patrols. Rotations lasted a year. Individual deployment systems meant units were constantly changing. Bonds formed quickly and were often broken by casualties. The psychological strain was immense. As the early 1970s progressed, American troop numbers steadily declined. By 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The agreement called for a ceasefire and the withdrawal of U.S. forces. American combat troops left Vietnam. But the war between North and South Vietnam was not over. For 2 more years, fighting continued. South Vietnam struggled to sustain defense without large-scale American support. In April 1975, North Vietnamese forces advanced towards Saigon. Television cameras captured scenes of evacuation. Helicopters lifted personnel from rooftops. Crowds gathered outside the U.S. embassy gates. On April 30th, 1975, Saigon fell. Vietnam was reunified under communist control. For the United States, the war had ended without the kind of victory that leaders once envisioned. The consequences would ripple for decades. When Saigon fell in April 1975, the images were unmistakable. A helicopter hovering above the U.S. embassy, a ladder lowered to a rooftop, desperate civilians pushing toward evacuation points. Marines holding a defensive perimeter as the final aircraft departed. For many Americans, those images did not just mark the end of a war. They symbolized something deeper. For the first time in its history, the United States had committed massive military force to a prolonged conflict and withdrawn without achieving its stated political objective. South Vietnam no longer existed as an independent state. But to understand why the war unfolded the way it did, we must look more closely at strategy. The American approach relied on overwhelming firepower, mobility, and technological superiority. Helicopters allowed rapid insertion into remote areas. B-52 bombers struck suspected supply lines. Artillery barges preceded ground operations. Yet the enemy's strategy was fundamentally different. North Vietnam and the Viet Cong focused on endurance. They did not need to win every battle. They needed to outlast American political will. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a vast network of jungle paths stretching through Laos and Cambodia, served as a lifeline for supplies and reinforcements. Despite sustained bombing, the network adapted, rerouted, and continued operating. North Vietnamese leadership understood the importance of morale. Ho Chi Minh and General Vo Nguyen Giat believed that if they maintained pressure long enough, domestic opposition within the United States would eventually force withdrawal. In many ways, the war became a test not only of military strength, but of political patience. At home, the anti-war movement grew broader. College campuses became centers of debate and protest. Demonstrations were not limited to students. Veterans, clergy, civil rights leaders, and parents of soldiers joined marches calling for de-escalation. Televised hearings exposed internal government doubts about progress in Vietnam. The publication of the Pentagon Papers in 1971 revealed that successive administrations had privately questioned the war's direction while publicly expressing confidence. Trust between the American public and its government weakened. The war's influence extended beyond politics. Culturally, it shaped music, film, literature, and journalism. It changed how Americans viewed authority. It altered civil-military relations. Returning veterans often encountered a country divided over the conflict in which they had served. Many came home quietly. Some faced misunderstanding or indifference. Others struggled with physical injuries and psychological trauma that, at the time, were not fully understood. The term post-traumatic stress disorder would only later enter mainstream vocabulary. The draft also left a lasting mark. Unlike later conflicts fought by volunteer forces, Vietnam relied heavily on conscription. Young men faced the possibility of being selected for service through a lottery system. The burden did not fall evenly across society, contributing to perceptions of inequality. As protests intensified in the late 1960s, divisions between generations became pronounced. Parents who had lived through World War II often viewed containment of communism as necessary. Many younger Americans questioned whether the cost in Vietnam justified the objective. The war exposed tensions about race as well. African American soldiers served in significant numbers, and civil rights leaders pointed out the contradiction between fighting for freedom abroad while inequality persisted at home. Muhammad Ali refused induction into the armed forces, citing religious and moral objections. His stance sparked national debate. Meanwhile, inside Vietnam, the conflict reshaped daily life. Villages were caught between opposing forces. Civilians faced displacement, bombardment, and uncertainty. The use of defoliants such as Agent Orange aimed to reduce jungle cover but left long-term environmental and health consequences. By the early 1970s, the United States faced a strategic crossroads. Nixon's policy of Vietnamization sought to reduce American ground involvement while increasing South Vietnamese capacity. Training and equipment were expanded. Air power remained a tool of pressure, particularly during the 1972 Easter Offensive launched by North Vietnam. Operation Linebacker bombing campaigns intensified, targeting supply lines and infrastructure. Negotiations in Paris became increasingly central. Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor, engaged in back-channel diplomacy with North Vietnamese representatives. The goal was to achieve a settlement that would allow American withdrawal while preserving some measure of stability for South Vietnam. In January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The agreement included a ceasefire, the withdrawal of U.S. forces, and the release of American prisoners of war. For many families, the return of POWs was a moment of relief. But the peace was fragile. Combat between North and South Vietnamese forces resumed almost immediately. Without sustained American military support, South Vietnam struggled to resist renewed offensives. By early 1975, North Vietnamese forces advanced rapidly. Provincial capitals fell in succession. Refugees crowded roads heading toward Saigon. The collapse unfolded faster than many American officials anticipated. On April 29th and 30th, Operation Frequent Wind evacuated remaining American personnel and thousands of Vietnamese allies. Helicopters lifted off from rooftops against the backdrop of a city on the brink. When the final aircraft departed, a chapter closed, but not cleanly. The war's legacy extended far beyond Southeast Asia. Internationally, it reshaped perceptions of American power. Allies and adversaries alike studied the conflict. It influenced future military doctrine. The concept of limited war under nuclear shadow was reconsidered. Policymakers debated the risks of gradual escalation versus decisive action. The so-called Vietnam Syndrome, a reluctance to engage in prolonged foreign conflicts, entered political vocabulary. Domestically, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution in 1973, seeking to limit presidential authority to deploy forces without legislative approval. The relationship between the executive branch and Congress shifted. Journalism also evolved. Reporters who had covered Vietnam influenced how future wars would be documented. Public access to battlefield realities became part of democratic accountability. Yet for many veterans, the war's impact was personal rather than geopolitical. Some returned to education or careers quietly. Others struggled with reintegration. Memorialization would take time. In 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C. Its design was stark, a black granite wall etched with the names of the fallen. Visitors run their fingers along engraved letters. They see reflections of themselves alongside names of the dead. The memorial does not offer triumph. It offers remembrance. The Vietnam War changed how Americans thought about conflict. It demonstrated that technological superiority does not guarantee political success. It showed that public opinion can shape military strategy. It revealed the complexity of fighting insurgency in unfamiliar terrain, and it underscored the human cost of prolonged war. But beyond policy and protest, beyond headlines and speeches, the war was lived by individuals. A Marine on patrol in the Mekong Delta, a nurse treating wounded in a field hospital, a Vietnamese farmer navigating between rival forces, a student watching nightly news in Ohio, a parent opening a letter from overseas. History often compresses events into timelines and treaties. But for those who experienced Vietnam, the war unfolded in moments. Decisions made under pressure, friendships formed in adversity, and uncertainty carried home. As the 1970s progressed, the United States faced the task of redefining its global role. The Cold War continued, but Vietnam had altered the calculus. Future leaders would weigh intervention more cautiously. Military planners would study counterinsurgency in greater depth. Public trust would remain a central concern. The war that began with Cold War containment ended with lessons about limits. It reshaped the relationship between government and governed. When the last American helicopter lifted away from Saigon in April 1975, it marked the end of direct U.S. involvement in Vietnam. But wars do not end when aircraft depart. They end slowly through memory, through policy, through the lives that continue long after the headlines fade. For the United States, Vietnam became more than a military conflict. It became a reference point. Every major foreign policy decision in the decades that followed carried an unspoken question. Is this another Vietnam? The war forced a reckoning with the limits of power. The United States had entered Vietnam with unmatched industrial capacity, advanced weaponry, and global alliances. Yet it struggled against an opponent whose strategy was rooted in patience, nationalism, and deep familiarity with terrain. The lesson was not that America lacked strength. It was that strength alone could not guarantee political outcomes in complex local conflicts. The war also reshaped civil-military relations. In previous generations, military service during World War II had been widely embraced as a shared national duty. Vietnam fractured that unity. The draft created tension. Some served willingly, others resisted, some fled abroad, others protested publicly. Court cases challenged the boundaries of conscience and obligation. After Vietnam, the United States moved toward an all-volunteer force. The change reflected both strategic planning and societal fatigue. No future war would rely on conscription in the same way. For veterans, the return home often came without ceremony. Unlike parades that followed earlier wars, many Vietnam veterans stepped back into civilian life quietly. Some carried visible injuries. Others carried memories they rarely discussed. In time, advocacy groups formed to support veterans dealing with physical and psychological wounds. Recognition evolved. The dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in 1982 marked a turning point. The wall's simplicity invited personal reflection rather than political argument. Names, not slogans. Memory, not judgment. Visitors trace the engraved letters. They leave flowers. They stand in silence. The memorial does not attempt to resolve the debates of the war. It honors those who served within it. For Vietnam itself, reunification under communist leadership brought its own transformations. Years of conflict had devastated infrastructure
General,
and displaced
urgent dispatch
millions.
from the front.
Economic hardship
They've
persisted
broken through
in
the
the
lines.
aftermath. In the decades that followed, Vietnam gradually rebuilt and reoriented its economy. Former adversaries slowly normalized relations. In 1995, the United States and Vietnam formally restored diplomatic ties. History moved forward, but it did not erase what had happened. The war also left environmental consequences. The use of defoliants like Agent Orange
See, now
damaged
this
forests
might
and
sting a little.
agricultural land. Health effects continued to
very
surface
brave.
years later, affecting both Vietnamese civilians and American veterans exposed during service. The impact extended beyond the battlefield. It touched families, communities, and public
They
health
can't just
systems.
overturn this election.
Politically,
It's an
Vietnam
outrage.
contributed
We
to a
won't
broader
stand for it.
skepticism of
Hold on,
official
let's see what it
narratives.
actually says.
The gap between public statements
Together now,
and private
push.
assessments during the war eroded confidence in government transparency. Investigative
Hold steady, man,
journalism
almost
gained
there.
prominence.
The hardest part
Congressional
is remembering the ones that
oversight
didn't make it back to a
intensified.
porch like this.
The War
Yeah.
Powers Resolution
Seems like
sought
yesterday
to ensure
sometimes.
that
We carry
future
them with us.
military engagements would
Always.
involve greater legislative accountability. Whether fully effective or not, it reflected a shift in how Americans viewed executive authority
Drive
in
it
matters
home,
of war.
boys.
Culturally,
Almost
Vietnam
there.
entered literature, cinema, and music in ways few previous conflicts had. Films grappled with moral ambiguity. Novels explored the psychology of soldiers navigating confusion rather than clear front lines. Songs questioned authority, mourned loss, and captured generational unease. The war became a mirror reflecting America's internal struggles over identity, race, generational values, and global responsibility. Yet beyond politics and culture, Vietnam underscored a universal reality of war. It is fought by individuals. A young soldier stepping into a humid jungle clearing. A helicopter pilot navigating low clouds over rice paddies. A
I do
Vietnamese
solemnly
mother
swear
guiding
that
her
the
children
testimony
away
I am
from
about to
distant
give
artillery
shall be
fire.
the truth,
A protester
the whole
holding a
truth,
sign
and
on a
nothing
college
but the
campus
truth.
thousands of miles away. Each experienced the conflict differently. Each carried its consequences forward. By the late 20th century, American military doctrine incorporated lessons drawn from Vietnam. Counterinsurgency strategies were studied more carefully.
All right, move
Greater
those barrels
emphasis
next.
was placed
We need
on
this dock
understanding
cleared by
local
noon.
political dynamics before committing large-scale forces. The war also influenced how the United States approached alliances and coalition building in future conflicts. Vietnam did not isolate America from global affairs, but it reshaped how leaders calculated risk. It also forced a broader reflection on national purpose. What does it mean to intervene? How is success defined? When does commitment become entanglement? These questions did not end in 1975. They continue to echo in policy debates decades later. Vietnam was not a simple story
I
of
believe this one
victory
is
or
yours,
defeat.
ma'am.
It was a
Thank the Lord.
complex convergence of Cold
It's from
War
Tom's.
ideology, regional nationalism, political miscalculation, and human endurance. It demonstrated how difficult it can be for a superpower to navigate local realities shaped by history and culture. It revealed the power of public opinion in a democratic society. And it showed that war's consequences extend far beyond the battlefield. Today, the Vietnam War remains a subject of study not only for historians but for
I
policymakers,
often
military
think of the cabin
officers,
and the warmth
journalists,
of the
and
hearth.
citizens.
I
It is
pray this letter
examined in
finds you all in
classrooms,
good health.
debated in
We
books,
miss you dearly.
remembered
As
at
we remember the
memorials.
fallen,
For those
let
who
us heed
served,
the
it is
warning
not an
etched in these
abstract lesson.
stones. The
It is a
price of
lived
liberty
chapter of
is
life.
eternal
For the
vigilance.
United States, it marked the end of unquestioned confidence in certain assumptions about power. For Vietnam, it marked the end of decades of colonial and civil conflict, but the beginning of new challenges. In 1955, when American involvement began quietly under the banner of advisory support, few imagined the scale of what would follow. By 1975, the conflict had altered both nations. The Vietnam War changed the United States forever, not only through loss but through introspection. It reshaped foreign policy. It influenced domestic politics. It redefined public trust. It transformed military structure. And it left a legacy written not just in treaties, but in names engraved on stone. History rarely offers simple endings. Vietnam offers something else. A reminder that power must be matched with clarity. That strategy must align with political reality, that democratic societies wrestle openly with the costs of war, and that the consequences of decisions made in distant capitals are carried by ordinary people. From the divided lines at the 17th parallel, to the jungles of the Mekong Delta, to the streets of Saigon, to the protests on American campuses, the Vietnam War became a defining chapter of the 20th century. Not because it was the largest war, not because it was the most technologically advanced, but because it forced a nation to confront the limits of its assumptions. And in doing so, it reshaped how the United States would see itself and the world ever after. It redefined what victory meant, and it left a generation marked by service and sacrifice. Yet to fully understand how Vietnam changed the United States forever, we must examine its lasting imprint on memory, on policy, and on the national identity itself.